Welcome to another tutorial video. This one is all about quick preparation for an internship or full-time job. A lot of people are starting or have already started their internships or full-time jobs, and you might be about to start one as well. And I want to go over here how to prepare quickly and get up to speed in PowerPoint. So we get a lot of questions about how to prepare quickly for internships and new jobs and so on. And these days, we get a lot of questions about more advanced things you could do, such as learning programming languages, automation tools, learning about AI, or how to use a ChatGPT plugin to prepare for Excel or PowerPoint or things like that. And all that's fine, but I think that as a new hire in investment banking or corporate finance, PowerPoint might be your highest ROI skill to focus on. And I'm saying that because it's very common. You will get a lot of work that involves PowerPoint and presentations and fixing things. And it also doesn't take that much time to become at least decent in the program. I would say that Excel is actually far more difficult to learn than PowerPoint. And if you spend maybe 5 to 10 hours on it, you could get to a pretty high proficiency level in PowerPoint, whereas it would take much longer for Excel and for programming languages, for example. So I'm going to give you here a 30-minute crash course on the key PowerPoint shortcuts and commands that are used in actual investment banking style presentations. Now, we're not going to cover Mac PowerPoint or macros or VBA or the slide master or tables or Excel and Word integration or images or a bunch of other things because we just don't have time, although we do have separate lessons and tutorials on at least some of these topics. For all the files and resources, you can go to mergersandinquisitions.com/investment-banking-PowerPoint-shortcuts. I'll list that URL below this video as well in the description. This is a very condensed version of our full PowerPoint and VBA course, but I hope here to give you enough to get up to speed and to start performing more quickly in PowerPoint. The plan for this tutorial is as follows. I'm going to start by telling you about the quick access toolbar and why it's so important. Then we'll go through some Windows shortcuts and slide fundamentals. Then we'll look at inserting and formatting shapes. And then we'll go through aligning and distributing shapes. And then we will group and order shapes, and you'll learn why and how this can be useful on certain slides. Let's start with the quick access toolbar. The quick access toolbar in PowerPoint and Excel and Word and other Office programs lets you build shorter versions of shortcuts or shortcuts for new commands. If you go to the options menu, Alt-T-O, so press Alt and release it, press T and release it, and then press O and go to Quick Access Toolbar. You can modify it there. I'm going to pull up the reference slides that we're using for all this. You can see right here, my Quick Access Toolbar is right here. If we go to Alt-T-O for options, and then Quick Access Toolbar over here on the side, you can see all the commands that I'm currently using for the Quick Access Toolbar that we recommend. To set this up yourself, the easiest method is to go to our page with the PowerPoint Quick Access Toolbar, breakingintowallstreet.com/kb/PowerPoint/quick-access-toolbar. And I'll pull up the page here so you can see it. We have everything here. We have the file that you can download, and then we have the full installation instructions. So before doing anything else, I would recommend reading through this and understanding a little bit about how to use it and the possible quirks with the program. If it doesn't work, you can create it yourself. So you can go to the options menu, Quick Access Toolbar, go to all commands, and then add them manually. In fact, if you want to do that, I have a full list here of all the commands that we recommend adding. So again, Alt-T-O options, Quick Access Toolbar, and then go to choose commands from all commands. And then you can just scroll through this list and add the ones that you want and add them to the Quick Access Toolbar over here on the side. You just click on the one you want and then click add, and it'll show up right here, and you can change around the order. You can also delete these. So there are a couple different options, but this is really important because, for example, you can just press Alt-1 with our Quick Access Toolbar and then L for align left. Whereas if you don't do it this way, it's a much longer and more drawn out shortcut. It's Alt-H, G, and then A, and then L. It's about 4 or 5 keystrokes rather than just 2 or 3 keystrokes. So it really saves you a lot of time to set this up front. So that's the first thing before you do anything else. Let's now go into part 2 and talk about Windows shortcuts and slide fundamentals. All the standard Windows and Office shortcuts that you should already know if you use a PC computer also work in PowerPoint. So Control-N for opening a new file, Control-O, Control-P for printing a file, Control-S for saving a file, F12 for saving a file as something. So Control+N opens a new file. If I close out of this, Control-O will allow me to pick which file I want to open. Control-P allows me to print a file. And then F12 here opens the Save As command. So all these still work in PowerPoint, and you're going to use them all the time. Control-C, Control-X, and Control-V activate the copy, cut, and paste commands. So I can click on a text box here, Control C, Control V to paste it, or I can click on something up here and do Control X to cut it, and then Control V to paste it. So all these commands still work in PowerPoint. And then the delete command deletes text, shapes, and slides, and then the escape command exits out of dialog boxes. So if I just want to delete something on this slide, I can just click it with the mouse and hit delete. And then if I go and I try to print the slides, but I change my mind, I can just press escape to get out of this. The undo and redo commands, Control plus Z and Control plus Y, also work. So if I delete something and I change my mind, I can press Control Z to undo it, or I can press Control Y to redo it. I'll press Control Z to take it back to its original state. I can do Control A for select all, so I can click not on any particular object, but just on some off area of this slide, and I can do Control A, and now everything on this slide is selected. I can do Control F4 to close a file, or I can press Alt F4 to close the entire PowerPoint program. So if I press Control F4 here, it prompts me and asks if I want to save my changes to these slides before I close the presentation. I'll say cancel for now because I actually don't want to close this. We can use Control F and Control H to find and replace. So Control F, I can search for something like total capital. And then it just shows me all the references here. I can go in and I can say total capital, and I can replace this with pink unicorn, for example. And now we see that I've replaced it. Obviously, this doesn't make any sense, so I'll press Control Z to change it back to total capital. Alt Tab will switch windows, and that's what I've been using as I've been switching back and forth between these two presentations. And then F4 will repeat your last action. So if I go in and let's say I delete this slide right here, I can press F4 and delete another one, and F4 and delete another one, and then I can press Control Z a bunch of times to undo everything that I just did right there. One point I'll mention here is that you want to be careful with what you've selected when you use these commands. So for example, if I click over on the left side where I see all the slides in this presentation, I can press delete here, and that deletes the slide. I'll press Control Z to undo it. But then if I click something on the actual slide, this will not delete the slide itself. It'll only delete this smaller shape or text box or something like that. So you always want to be careful about what you've selected before you start using these commands. Those are all the standard Windows and Office shortcuts that still work in PowerPoint and are still good to know and that you'll be using all the time. Let's go to some of the slide-specific shortcuts now. If you want to insert a new slide, Control M is the fastest way to do it, but the most flexible way to do it is Alt H-I. Now, Control plus M means you press and hold Control, and then you press M and release it. So as you're pressing and holding the Control key, you press M and then you release them both at the same time. The comma here for Alt H-I means you press Alt, release it, press H, release it, and then press I. Let's look at how they work. So if I go back to this presentation and I go here and I press Control M, I get another slide that uses effectively the same template as this first one here. It looks a lot different, but it's using the same template. Whereas if I press Alt H-I, now I get this choice. Do I want a title and content slide, a to content slide, a title only slide, a picture with caption slide? So I can select exactly the type of layout or template that I want to use. I will press Control Z to undo this because I don't actually want either of those for right now. Control Shift D is probably the most useful shortcut for inserting slides though, because this lets you duplicate your current slide regardless of what you selected. So if I go here, and let's say I've selected some text box on this slide. If I press Control Shift D, I duplicate the entire slide over here, and now slides 1 and 2 are the same thing. And it doesn't matter that I'm not in the slide area when I activated this. All that matters is that I was on a specific slide and the command duplicated that entire slide. This is how I almost always insert new slides and work with existing slides in PowerPoint. I find it to be one of the most useful shortcuts. The Home key jumps to the first slide in your presentation, and the End key jumps to the last slide. So the End key takes me all the way down to slide 4. Home takes me all the way up to slide 1. These are also useful, especially if you have a very long presentation that's not just 4 slides. If it's 40 or 50 or 100 slides, it's a very fast way to jump around. Page up and page down will advance you. Page up will go to the previous slide, and then page down will go to the next slide. So I can press page down a few times and move down like this, and then I can press the page up key a few times and move up like this. The other nice thing about these is that even if you've selected a shape on this slide, if you press page up or page down, it ignores that and it just advances you to the next slide anyway. So you could use the arrow keys to do this as well if you have selected slides over here, but if you use the arrow keys and you've selected a shape, it's actually going to move the shape around. The nice thing about page up and page down is that they ignore the shapes that you've selected and they just advance you up or down in the slides over on the left-hand side. Let's go to part 3 and talk about inserting and formatting shapes now. And for this, I'm going to go to the last slide in the presentation here. So I'll press the N key just because we have a lot of blank space here. And I think it's a little bit easier to show you what to do on this mostly empty slide. So the key insertion shortcuts are Alt-09 for drawing a shape and then Alt-8 for drawing a normal rectangle. Both of these use our quick access toolbar. So if I press Alt-09, you can see that I get a selection here of different shapes, triangles, rectangles, lines, all sorts of different things. If I just select an oval right here, I can go and draw it right here. I'm just pressing and dragging the mouse to do this. Now, the other way to do this is you can press Alt-8, and this selects specifically a standard rectangle, and then I can draw it like this. So these are two common ways to do this, and it just depends on whether you want a selection of shapes with Alt-09 or whether you know you want a rectangle with the Alt-8 shortcut. Alt-9 will draw a horizontal text box, and then Alt-08 will draw a standard line. So if I press Alt-9, I get a text box right here, and I can start typing in it. So I can type something like testing text box, and you can see how a text box differs from a shape. The text box has no background color, whereas a shape has this background color, it has a white font size, it's centered. The text box is left aligned, it has black text, and so it's quite a bit different by default. The Alt-08 shortcut for drawing a line, so if I press Alt-08 right now, I can just draw a line right there, again using the mouse, and then Alt-08 again, and let's draw a vertical line this time, so going down like that. So now we have some lines and shapes on our slide. One of the most useful shortcuts with all of this is pressing and holding the Shift key while you're doing this, because if you do that, so if I go to Alt-8, for example, and then I press and hold the Shift key and I draw a shape right here, this lets me draw the square or rectangle, but keep the height to width ratio constant. So I'm effectively always drawing a square like this. Now, if I apply it with a line, Alt-08, and I press and hold the Shift key like this, it only lets me draw a straight line, which is often what you want in these types of presentations. So I often press and hold the Shift key when inserting lines and shapes like this. We get some questions about how to draw shapes and lines yourself versus automatically inserting them. And the short answer is it depends on what you use for the final click. Do you use the mouse or the keyboard? Now, it doesn't really matter because if you don't get what you want, you can always use the mouse to resize the shape. But to show you an example of what I mean, let's say, for example, that I go up here and I go to Alt-09 and then I just click on the rectangle right here. Since I use the mouse to do that, I can now draw this wherever I want. But if I go up and I go to Alt-09 and then I use the arrow keys to move over on the keyboard and then I press Enter, it automatically inserts a shape right there. So it just depends on what you want. If you want it to be automatically inserted, use the keyboard and press Enter. If you want to draw it yourself, use the mouse. Once you've inserted objects, you can also select and edit them. And the main useful shortcut here is the Shift key. If you press Shift and then you left click on all these shapes, you will select multiple shapes and lines at the same time, and then you can move them around like I'm doing right now using the mouse, pressing and holding and dragging it. If you press Shift and then drag the diagonal edge of a shape, it lets you resize the shape while keeping the height to width ratio constant. So here, for example, with this oval, if I press and hold Shift and then drag the diagonal edge like that, it lets me resize it, and then same with the shape over here. And you can see the applications if you look at an investment banking style slide where you lay out different scenarios and you want to resize something here, you can press and hold Shift and drag the diagonal edge and just make it bigger, and then you can go in and change the font size if you want. So that would be an actual example in this particular presentation. If you press Shift and then you drag the shape itself, you will move the shape and you'll keep the horizontal or vertical axis constant. So for example, let's go back to one of these slides and let's go here and let's just use the mouse to select all of these. And now let's press and hold the Shift key, and then I'll drag this over and you can see what's happening. They're moving in a straight line, which is very useful. If I move them up and down, the same thing happens. They are moving, but they're not really shifting over. They're just moving up or down in a straight line like this because I'm pressing and holding the Shift key. I'll press Control Z a few times to undo that, and then I'll press End to jump to the last slide here. The bottom line is that the Shift key is really important, and it lets you do a lot of things in PowerPoint. It lets you select multiple shapes. You could also use the mouse to do this, but I often find the Shift key is easier when they're overlapping with other things on the slide. The Shift key lets you resize shapes and keep the height to width ratio constant. And then when you're actually drawing shapes, the Shift key lets you keep them straight or keep the height to width ratio constant if you're inserting a rectangle or a circle or something like that. With formatting, Alt-5 is the key shortcut, or the one shortcut to rule them all, as I write right here. Alt-5 gets you to the Format Shape menu, and then Alt-JD gets you to the Shape Format menu in the ribbon menu. They're a little bit different, but let me show you how they compare. So if I click on the oval here and I go to Alt-5, you can see that we have a lot of options for the alignment of the text, for the margins, for how we actually want the text to appear, for the fill color that we want. So there are a lot of different options for this. Now, if you go to Alt-JD instead, we do still get some options here for sure, but they're not quite as extensive as in the Alt-5 menu. So Alt-JD is a bit of a simpler way to do this. You can adjust the height and width of a shape manually over here on the side. The other nice thing is that if you select a line, Alt-5 does not work, but Alt-JD does work. And so you can adjust the line's width here manually. So if I set this to something like 8.5 inches, we can do that within the Alt-JD menu. There are some other shortcuts that are part of our quick access toolbar as well, like the font color, fill color, shape outline, and font size. So with the font color, if I click on a shape and I go to Alt-2, I can go and change the font color to orange. If I go to Alt-3, I can change the fill color to yellow. And if I go to Alt-4, I can select no outline to get rid of the border, or I can keep the border, but I can just change the size of it by going to weight right here and changing it to 3 points or 1 point or 4.5 points or something else like that. And then if I go to Alt-7, I can change the font size, and then I can make it size 24 font, for example. Or I can go in the other direction and change it back to size 12 font. So those are a couple of things that you can activate on our quick access toolbar. You can also use these standard Windows or Office shortcuts, Control-B, Control-I, and Control-U to bold, italicize, or underline text, and Control+L, E, or R to left, center, or right align text. So if we go in here, for example, I can press Control-B to bold it. Maybe I should change the font size first. I'll change it to size 24. And then I'll change the color again, Alt-2, and I'll move this back to black for the color. I can press Control-I to italicize it, and Control-U to underline it, Control-E to center it, Control-L to left align it, and Control-R to right align it. So those are a few things you can do there. One other thing I want to note is that with formatting, you can apply it to everything in the shape or just a specific text. So going back to some of our slides up here, let's say that we want to go in and we want to only bold some of our text up here. Jaguar is significantly undervalued at its current share price. I could go in and I could just select everything here. So I could just use the mouse and select everything here at the end, Control-B to unbold it, and that would be an option. But generally speaking, it's better to apply it to everything in the shape. So select the shape, just click on it and press Control-B to bold everything here, Control-B again to unbold it. And that's what we prefer to do when making these types of edits. Once you have set up all of your shapes and you have the colors, the borders, the fonts, you normally don't want to reinvent the wheel. So the better solution is to copy and paste shape formats around. Control+Shift+C will copy the shape format, and Control+Shift+V will paste the shape format. So again, press and hold Control, press and hold Shift, and then press C and release all these keys at once to activate the shortcut. Press and hold Control, press and hold Shift, and then press V and release everything at once to activate the paste shape format command. So if I go here, and let's say I want to transfer some of our formatting, Control-Shift-C, and then Control-Shift-V. Control-Shift-C, and then Control-Shift-V to copy and paste the shape formatting up there, and I'll press Control-Z to undo both of these. You could apply this to almost anything. So I could say Control-Shift-C, and then Control-Shift-V, and now this shape changes the color and the font size and all of that. So these are very, very useful commands. Control+D will duplicate an object, and then Control, Shift, and Drag will duplicate the object in place and let you move it around more easily. So if I go up to the first slide here, and let's say I click this current valuation box over here, and I press Control-D, now I've duplicated it, I can press Control-D again, and I keep duplicating it. I'll press Control-Z a bunch of times to undo that. What I can also do is click this and then press Control, hold it down, Shift, hold it down, and then just drag this, and I create a duplicate, and it moves in a straight line like this. Or I could do it the other way, Control, Shift, hold those both down, and then just drag it this way. And this lets me create a duplicate that I can put anywhere I want in this slide presentation. These shortcuts, Control-Shift-C and Control-Shift-V, will copy most formatting properties, but they're not going to copy everything. They're not going to copy the actual content in terms of the text. They're also not going to copy the height and width. So they're very useful, but they do have some limitations that you should be aware of. Let's move to part 4 now and talk about aligning and distributing shapes. The first thing to understand is that aligning and distributing shapes is very important because, for example, oftentimes, I'll just mess up this slide a little bit to show you what often happens. Oftentimes you will get a slide that looks something like this, where you can see the intent maybe, but it's not quite right. A lot of things are misaligned. Maybe some of the text boxes here are off. Maybe something like this, where someone else has edited the slide, but it's not in a very user-friendly format. It's not aligned very well. And if a client or someone internally were looking at your presentation, they would look at this and say, okay, what are you doing here? What does this look like? Why doesn't this look very good when we print it out and look at it, for example? So you often get slides like this that need to be fixed. The first thing to understand about alignment is that there are two modes, aligning to the slide and then aligning selected objects. If you go to the Alt-1 menu in the Quick Access toolbar, you can see both of them here, align to slide and align selected objects. Now by default, in PowerPoint, it's set to align to slide. You almost never want to use this though. And to activate the align selected objects command, you need to select at least two objects. So if I press and hold Shift and I click these two boxes on the side and I go to Alt-1 and then O for align selected objects, now if I have that mode set, anytime I execute an alignment command, it's going to be based on the objects that I've selected, not the slide. This is useful because now I can go to the alignment menu and I can align these to the left, to the right, to the center, to the top, to the middle, to the bottom. I can also scroll in and out with Control plus the mouse scroll wheel or the Alt-VZ command. So let's take a look at some of how this works. First off, if I press and hold the Control key and I scroll the mouse scroll wheel, I will zoom out like this. If I move in the other direction, I will zoom in like this, or I can press Alt-VZ and enter the zoom percentage manually. You often use these commands when you're trying to zoom in and trying to line up shapes. With the alignment commands, I can just use the mouse and select everything on the side, and then let's say I want to align everything to the left. I can press Alt-1, I can make sure that align selected objects is selected, Alt-1-0, and then Alt-1-L for align left. And now everything is left aligned. This is fine, but it's probably not what you want because we probably want some space on the margin of the slide, over on the left edge of the slide here. So what you usually want to do is undo this, Control-Z, and then press and hold Shift and move these over to the right. Then you want to press and hold Shift and left click Project Jaguar or the Goldman Stanley logo at the bottom, and then press Alt-1-L, and now everything will be left aligned to the left edges of here because these alignment commands always work based on finding the furthest left or furthest right or furthest top shape and then aligning everything to the edge of that. So that is how we do that. If you want to do the same thing up here, you can. If we press Shift and then left click each of these, Alt-1-T, now we've top aligned all these. And the same goes for all these text boxes. I can select everything here, press and hold Shift to drag it over a little bit, Alt-1-L, we have that. And then I can select all these with the mouse. I can move these over with Shift and the mouse button, Alt-1-L, and now we've left aligned these. And then same idea right here. So let's just take all these, Shift and move them over, and then Shift and left click the management forecast shape, Alt-1-L, and now we have left aligned all of these. There are plenty of other options here. I can do align middle with Alt-1-M, for example, but that's not going to be too terribly useful in this case. In a lot of cases, you have aligned many objects, but the spacing between them is not equal. Now, you could go in and you could, for example, see that the spacing is not equal on the slide, and you could try to fix it manually by moving these shapes around like I'm doing right now. But the better way to do it is to actually use the distribution commands, Alt-1-H for distribute horizontally and Alt-1-V for distribute vertically. The align to slide versus align selected objects options also apply here, so you have to be careful, but let's go in and see how this works. So if I just use the mouse, press and drag it and select everything here, and then I press Alt-1-V, now everything is distributed properly. It looks much better. The spacing between each of these is the same. I can do the same thing here for these text boxes. I can select all of them with the mouse, or I can press and hold Shift and then just click on them individually, and then Alt-1 each, and now they're all distributed horizontally. I can even do the same thing for these text boxes right here. So I could go down and I could take this one text box and then I could select the shape with Shift and left click, Alt-1-M for align middle. And then I could take everything else here, Alt-1-V, and now I've distributed these vertically. And then to get everything to line up, I can press Shift and left click all these at the bottom, Alt-1-B for align bottom. And then I can do the same thing up here with the distribution. So I can take all these, select them using the mouse, Alt-1-V for distribute vertically. And then same thing here, select them all with the mouse, Alt-1-V for distribute vertically, and that's how you can do that. So these are some helpful commands that you often execute when you're fixing up slides. I'll show you a few other tips here for alignment and distribution before we move on to the last part. The ruler is very useful because it lets you insert objects at more precise locations. And you can see my ruler up here at the top. I'm in the US system, so I'm using inches rather than centimeters, but if you're in another region, you will be using centimeters instead. If you press Alt-WR, you can toggle the ruler on and off. I always prefer to leave it on because I like to know that I'm inserting something at the 4-inch or the 3-inch or the 2-inch mark right up here. Smart guides are also very useful. These display a dashed line when you move shapes and you aim for equidistant spacing or perfect alignment. If you go to Alt-WX, you can make sure that these are actually enabled. So Alt-WX, and then you want to make sure that display smart guides when shapes are aligned is checked. And I also do like to display drawing guides, but we'll get to that in a little bit. For now, I'll just keep the smart guides enabled. Now, the advantage of this shortcut is that if you're moving a shape around, let's say the consensus forecast one up here, and let's say you're moving it over, you can see that these dashed lines now pop up to tell you that the spacing is equidistant between this shape and the one on the left and the one on the right. And the same thing goes for everything over here. If I start moving this, you can see that all these lines pop up to tell me that the spacing is correct, that it's equidistant spacing between everything. If I move something out of alignment, you can also see that, for example, I could go in and I could distribute this vertically, or I could just use the smart guides that pop up and figure it out based on that. So I'm just moving this down a little bit, and you can see how now, once I get it into exactly the right position, those smart guides tell me that the spacing is correct between all these shapes. Custom drawing guides are also very useful, especially when you want to use one layout across many slides. And to activate these, you can press Alt-WS to display the guides. You can now see these gray lines on screen. If you press and hold Control and you drag the mouse, you can create a new guide. And if you drag the guide off the slide, you delete the guide. So for example, if I press and hold Control and I drag this horizontal guide, I create a new one up here. And if I press and hold Control and drag it down, I create a new guide down here. And so I can create new guides like this. If I decide that I don't need them anymore, I can then just drag them off the slide and be done with them, and I won't have to worry about them anymore. So these are another helpful reference. I sometimes use these, I sometimes don't. It depends a little bit on the slide and how well aligned and distributed it already is. For now, I'll press Alt-WS and temporarily disable them. Let's now move to the last part, grouping and ordering shapes. Sometimes in PowerPoint, you've aligned and distributed many objects, and you want PowerPoint to treat them as just one object. It's easier to move around one object, to resize it, and to align and distribute it when you have one single shape rather than 10 or 15 different shapes. So to group objects together, you can press Ctrl-G, and then to ungroup them, you can press Ctrl-Shift-G. Let's look at a few examples of how this works. So let's say on this slide that I want to delete these bottom parts right here, and I want to create my own new part based on what's up here at the top. I could select everything here, and I could just press Shift, Control, and then drag this down like this, and that would certainly be one option, but I would say that it's probably a little bit better to group these together first. Control-G, and now this is literally one object. I can press Shift, Control, and drag it down, and I get it like this, and it's much less likely to move out of alignment if I do it like that. I'll press Ctrl-Z a few times here to undo this. I can do the same thing here. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes to select all these different shapes and text boxes. You could easily forget one, or you could get the selection slightly wrong. But if you select them all once and then you press Ctrl-G, now you can press and hold the Shift key and move them around like this, and they all move as one shape. It's especially helpful on slides like this one where you have compound shapes, because you don't really want to be moving these around all the time individually. You really want to treat them as one shape, so you can press Ctrl-G, and then if you decide that you want to duplicate this, you can press Ctrl-Shift and drag this down and do it again and do it again, and now you get multiple other shapes like that, and it's easier because they're all grouped together. I'll press Ctrl-Z a bunch of times to undo that. If you decide you don't want to have these grouped, you can just press Control-Shift-G and you can undo it. So that's grouping. Moving objects backward and forward is also useful, especially for complex objects where you have one shape on top, also for combo objects where you have a table and shapes combined onto one slide. The key shortcuts here are Alt-6R for bringing it to the front and Alt-6K for bringing it to the back. There's also Alt-6F and Alt-6B for sending it forward or backward, but I don't personally find these all that helpful. Let's take a look at how these work on this slide. So let's say that we have some type of scenario where maybe everything here is out of order. So I'm going to send some of these to the front, and then I'm going to send some of these to the back, and it looks something like this. Now, obviously, you can tell that the first object here is not correct compared to the second one. And to fix this very simply, we could take this gray shape and I can go to Alt-6K to send it to the back. And I can go to this black box on the side and I can go to Alt-6K and send this to the back. And now we can see that this looks correct. So it's very, very useful for slides like this that have these types of compound shapes and objects, and you'll use it all the time here. And that's about it. I know we went through a lot here, but it was actually only around 30 minutes, and hopefully now you should have a much better idea of the key shortcuts and commands in PowerPoint. To summarize, we started out by going over the quick access toolbar. I highly recommend going to our website and downloading the version of the quick access toolbar that we make available for free. And I have the link for this within the PowerPoint slides and also below this video, so I highly recommend doing that. It's going to make your life a lot easier. We then went through Windows shortcuts. Shortcuts like opening and closing files and undo and redo still work in PowerPoint, and then the slide fundamentals for inserting slides, selecting the ones you want, duplicating slides, and so on. Then we went through inserting and formatting shapes and how you can use the quick access toolbar to speed this up. I really like the Control-Shift-C and Control-Shift-V shortcuts for copying and pasting styles here. Also Control-D and then the Control-Shift-Drag shortcut for taking a shape, copying it, and moving it down or across in a straight line. Then we went over aligning and distributing shapes, and you learned the difference between align to slide and align selected objects. I really like the align left, align center, and align right commands here, and also the distribution ones, Alt-1H and Alt-1V for distribute horizontally and vertically. They're super useful as you go through and you have to modify slides that are very messy or not correct, such as this one where all the spacing was off originally. And then finally, we ended with grouping and ordering shapes, and you learned how to send shapes forward and backward and why it can be useful, especially when you're dealing with a complex shape or something like a table plus other shapes. As I said, we really only scratched the surface here. This is just a 30-minute crash course, but hopefully now you should be a little bit more efficient, and you should have some tools that will help you become even more efficient, like our quick access toolbar and some of the other shortcut lists, links, and references that I'm including in the link below this video and in the blog post accompanying this tutorial.